Oklahoma is supposed to be simple. Cowboys, pickup trucks, wide open prairie where the sky swallows the horizon. That's the postcard version anyway. But if you peel that image back just a little, something else starts to emerge. Older, stranger, less interested in being explained. Hidden in these hills and forests are things that don't quite fit. A massive stone carved with Viking-style runes in a shadowed valley near Heavener. A buried city of earth mounds and copper masks near Spiro. Mysterious carvings in tiny sandstone caves that some swear look Egyptian. Ice Age spear points lying silent under a farmer's field near Cooperton. Faint red figures and spirals clinging to the rock near Alabaster Caverns like echoes that refuse to let go. Some of these mysteries are tied to native traditions. Others seem to come out of nowhere. All of them raise the same unsettling question. How much of this land's story have we forgotten? Tonight, we're going to follow those questions into the trees, the hills, and the caves of Oklahoma's ancient past, and see what still whispers back. If you start in that postcard Oklahoma and drive southeast, the land slowly closes in. The sky drops, the hills rise, and the trees gather thicker around the road. Near the quiet little town of Heavener, the world feels just a bit older, like it's holding something back. Deep in the forest here, tucked into a mossy hillside, there's a sandstone slab that looks like it was left behind by giants. 12 feet tall, 10 feet wide. Not standing upright like a movie monolith, but leaning, heavy, like it's been watching the woods for a very long time. Walk closer, and you'll see it. Sharp-edged symbols, cut deep into the rock. Not doodles, not initials. These lines curl and angle in a way that feels foreign and familiar at the same time, like you've seen them in a history book or a video game. They look like something straight out of a Viking saga. This is the Heavener Runestone. For a long time, locals didn't think of it as a mystery at all. It was just there. Kids in the early 1900s used to climb around it, play near it, dare each other to touch the carvings. Families might point it out on a walk the way you'd point out an odd-shaped tree. Interesting, sure, but not rewrite history interesting. That changed in the 1920 seconds, when researchers finally took a serious look. Those strange markings? They looked an awful lot like runes from the Elder Futhark, one of the oldest known runic alphabets used by Norse and Germanic peoples between about 150 and 800 AD. That's the same kind of writing carved into stones in Norway, Sweden, and Iceland. So what on earth is it doing on a hillside in Oklahoma? One group of believers says the answer is simple and wild at the same time. The stone proves that Norse explorers didn't just land on the shores of North America. According to this theory, they pushed deep inland, sailing rivers, crossing forests, and leaving their mark on places we never imagined they'd reached. Heavener, in that version of history, becomes a waypoint, a carved message or border stone whispering across the centuries. We were here. So, Serd Forgetman. If that's true, if Vikings really hacked their story into this Oklahoma hillside, then a huge piece of the history we're taught about who got here when and how far they traveled would need to be rewritten. But that's not the only story. A lot of professional historians argue for a quieter explanation. In the 1800s, waves of Norwegian and Swedish immigrants moved into the Midwest and parts of Oklahoma. They carried trunks, tools, and something else: culture. Old songs, old stories, old alphabets. Runes weren't just ancient relics to them. In some places they were still known, still taught, still used as a connection to the past. So picture this instead. A young Scandinavian immigrant standing in a strange new land. The trees are different. The heat is different. Even the sky feels different. Surrounded by unfamiliar language and customs, they carve into that giant stone not as a claim of conquest, but as a lifeline to home, something permanent, something that says, in a language their ancestors would recognize, we existed here, we mattered here. A Viking boundary marker, or an immigrant's love letter to their own history. Both possibilities hang over that slab of sandstone like twin shadows. The stone itself doesn't pick a side. It just sits there, massive and silent, daring anyone who sees it to decide what they believe. Stand in front of the Heavener runestone long enough, and your eyes start to trace the lines like you're reading a language you almost remember. And in a way, you are. Most researchers agree that the inscription likely refers to a place name, Gloam's Valley, or Valley of Gloam. Gloam is thought to be an Old Norse personal name, the kind a real person would have carried 1,000 years ago. It's not a prophecy, not a spell, not a treasure map. It's simple. almost ordinary, like someone carving their name into the land itself. This is Gloam's Valley, if you consider it in Faluz, but if you ask 5 experts exactly how to read the stone, you'll get 6 answers. And that's where the mystery gets messier and more interesting. Because here's the strange part. Not all of the runes on the stone match the same time period. Some of them look like classic Elder Futhark characters, the kind that would fit comfortably in the Viking Age. Others, though, seem closer to later rune styles, used centuries afterward. It's like opening a book and finding half the sentence written in medieval script and the other half in modern handwriting. That kind of mashup shouldn't happen if the stone is genuinely ancient. Languages evolve, sure, but not all at once on a single rock. That's one of the main reasons a lot of scholars lean away from the Viking theory. They argue that whoever carved this wasn't a historian. They were someone with rune knowledge, or at least access to rune charts, who mixed symbols from different eras without realizing it. Imagine getting a tattoo that you think says Warrior of Light in ancient Greek, and it ends up more like Light Warrior Pizza, because the grammar is all wrong. You've got the shapes, but not the centuries of context behind them. Still, this wasn't lazy work. The stone is huge. The carvings are deep, careful, deliberate. This wasn't a bored teenager scratching a heart and initials into a tree. Whoever carved the runestone took time, strength, and serious intent. Whether they were a Norse explorer or an immigrant farmer, they wanted this message to outlive them. Today, the site is part of an Oklahoma state park, and that's where the mystery starts to feel less like an academic debate and more like an experience. The forest around the stone is thick and green. Trails wind through the trees, birds call overhead, and the noise of the modern world drops away quicker than you expect. When you walk up to the shaded overlook where the stone rests, it doesn't feel like a tourist trap. It feels quiet, watchful. Inside the visitor center, they lay it all out. The Viking theory, the immigrant theory, the translation attempts, the questions no one can quite nail down. Nobody tries to sell you one answer. Instead, the displays almost invite you to argue with them in your head, to weigh the evidence yourself. Once a year, the park hosts a Runestone festival. There's food, music, crafts, kids running around with wooden shields and cardboard helmets. You'll see nods to Native American traditions, pioneer heritage, and Norse imagery all braided together in a way that shouldn't work, but somehow does. It's less about proving Vikings came here, and more about celebrating the collision of stories this place represents. And then there are the older stories, the ones that don't fit neatly into museum panels. Some Choctaw oral traditions speak of pale-skinned visitors from the east, tall strangers who appeared and vanished again. Not Vikings by name, not stamped with a date, just visitors. Those tales rarely make it into school textbooks, but they hang in the background like a low drumbeat, another layer to a mystery already thick with maybes. So what is the Heavener runestone really? A misplaced relic, an immigrant monument, a miscopied alphabet, a beacon for people who like their history unresolved. Maybe the stone itself is less about proof and more about possibility, a reminder that the stories we're certain of rarely tell the whole truth. You leave the park with more questions than answers, and somehow, that feels right. Drive east across Oklahoma, and the land shifts again. The forests thin, the hills roll softer, and somewhere in the quiet distance the Arkansas River glints like a slipped piece of sky. Out here, near the town of Spiro, there's a low grassy rise that most people don't even glance at. It just looks like another hill. Cows graze nearby. Trucks hum along the highway. Nothing about it screams ancient power. There is those. But that hill isn't just a hill. It's the surface of a buried city. This is Spiro Mounds, one of the most important and most overlooked archaeological sites in all of North America. Long before Europeans showed up, long before the name Oklahoma existed, this place was part of a vast civilization we now call the Mississippian culture. It stretched from the Great Lakes down to the Gulf, from the southeast into the plains. These weren't wandering bands. They built cities. Real cities. Think wide plazas and raised earthen mounds arranged with purpose, not accident. Wooden temples and council houses. Homes clustered around ceremonial centers. Leaders, priests, artisans, traders, each with a role in a complicated social web. Spiro was one of their shining hubs, active from around 800 to 1450 AD, reaching its peak between roughly 1200 and 1400. Thousands of people lived here, prayed here, made decisions that affected lands hundreds of miles away. And yet, for centuries after they left, the city slept under that hill. Fast forward to the 1930 seconds. A group of local men formed something they called the Poteau Mining Company, not because they wanted coal or iron, but because they wanted whatever valuables might be buried in the mounds. They weren't archaeologists, they were treasure hunters. And to them, Craig Mound, the largest of Spiro's mounds, looked like a gamble worth taking. They dug in, literally. What they found inside was beyond anything they expected. Craig Mound had been a sealed burial chamber, undisturbed for centuries, like a time capsule packed by people who fully believed what they were doing mattered. Inside were artifacts that still take your breath away when you see photos of them. Sheets of hammered copper shaped into human faces, some calm, some fierce, some almost eerily lifelike. Masks that looked like spirits stepping through the boundary between worlds. Thousands of pearls strung into ornaments. Marine shells carved and engraved, hauled all the way from distant coasts. Effigies of animals and humans, ceremonial pipes, obsidian blades that came from the Rockies, mica from the Appalachians, woven fabrics and wooden staffs. Each object was a sentence in a language of power, status, and belief. But instead of treating it like a library, the treasure hunters treated it like a vault. They used shovels. They used picks. At one point, they even used dynamite. Artifacts were ripped from their positions, their careful arrangements destroyed. Items were sold off to collectors, scattered to museums, and private hands across the country. Some pieces vanished entirely, swallowed by time and basements and backrooms. By the time professional archaeologists were finally allowed onto the site, it was like walking into the aftermath of a looted tomb. The structure of Craig Mound, the way bodies were placed, the way offerings ringed them had been shattered. So much information that could have told us who these people were, how they ruled, what they believed, was gone in a matter of months. And yet, even through that destruction, Spiro still speaks. The artifacts that survived, and the fragments of structure that remained, told archaeologists one thing loud and clear. The people who built this city weren't just surviving on the margins. They were thriving. Their trade networks stretched in every direction. Items from Spiro have connections to places hundreds, even thousands of miles away. This wasn't a forgotten backwater. It was a hub, politically powerful, spiritually charged, culturally rich, a place where decisions and ceremonies rippled outward like waves, and it all hid under a hill most drivers still don't notice. Even after the chaos of the looting, the pieces that remained at Spiro started to knit together a picture of a civilization that was anything but simple. The more archaeologists studied what was left, the clearer it became. This wasn't just a village with a fancy burial mound. This was a center of gravity. The objects from Craig Mound and surrounding areas whispered of long-distance networks that would put some modern trade routes to shame. Obsidian blades that matched rock from the Rocky Mountains, shimmering mica that pointed back to the Appalachian region, marine shells from distant coasts, copper plates that likely came from far to the north and east. Spiro sat at the crossroads of it all. This wasn't a community cut off from the world. It was plugged in, connected. Leaders here weren't just thinking about their own town. They were part of a web of power reaching across rivers and plains and forests. Some artifacts show similarities to pieces found at other Mississippian sites like Moundville in Alabama and Etowah in Georgia. Same kinds of stylized birds, warriors, and spiritual beings. The artwork feels like variations on a shared visual language. Imagine that. A spiritual and political system so wide-reaching that its symbols appear across what are now multiple states, all carved and hammered and painted by different hands that still told the same stories. Among the most striking pieces is a wooden cane or scepter, carved with symbols that might have marked its bearer as a person of enormous status, maybe a high priest, maybe a chief whose authority flowed from both politics and the sacred. Copper plates shaped into human faces show expressions we recognize instantly. Anger, pride, calm. You can't look at them without feeling like someone is staring right back through time. And then, suddenly, it stopped. By the mid-1400s, Spiro was abandoned. The mounds were sealed. The plazas fell silent. Grass began to take back the carefully shaped earth. No stone walls collapsed here. It wasn't that kind of city. But something in the balance broke. Why? That's one of the biggest unanswered questions. Maybe climate shifted, and drought hit too hard, too long. Maybe trade routes moved and the city's power dried up. Maybe internal politics turned ugly, and the people lost faith in their leaders. Some researchers think sealing Craig Mound itself may have marked a turning point, a ritual closing of a spiritual chapter that rewired their belief system and power structure. Whatever happened, the result was the same. The people left, and time closed over their footsteps. For centuries, the only ones who really remembered were the descendants of those ancient builders. Indigenous tribes in the region held stories of sacred places, of old cities, of spiritual centers where leaders spoke to the cosmos as much as to their people. But when treasure hunters arrived in the 1930 seconds, those stories weren't treated as evidence. They were treated as background noise. Today, that's finally changing. Spiro Mounds is now protected by the Oklahoma Historical Society. There's a modest visitor center, interpretive signs, a looping trail that curls through open prairie and past the rises of the mounds. On a quiet day, you might stand there with only the wind and insects for company, the mounds rising softly against the sky like sleeping giants. And the voices telling the story are changing too. Nations like the Caddo and Osage, whose ancestors have deep ties to this region, are stepping forward to interpret the site through their own histories and traditions. They're not just being mentioned, they're speaking. They're helping reconnect the artifacts and earthworks to the beliefs and stories they came from. That shift matters. For too long, indigenous people were treated like a footnote to Spiro's story, instead of its core. Now, when you walk the site, you're invited to see it as more than an archaeological puzzle. It's a place of memory and survival, of brilliance that was nearly erased. Visit Spiro, and you won't find roller coasters or neon signs. Just grass, sky, and those mounds, their slopes softened by centuries, their presence heavy in a way you feel more than see. You don't see the city that once stood here, but if you stand still, if you listen, you might feel its echo. Because Spiro isn't just Oklahoma's hidden past. It's part of America's story that we pushed out of frame. And it's still here, waiting to be heard. Head northwest now, out of the humid green and into the drier grasslands of Oklahoma, where the land spreads wide and the sky feels enormous again. Near the small town of Freedom, the hills turn pale, and the rock starts to show through the soil. Sandstone bluffs rising out of the grass like old bones. At first glance, nothing here looks extraordinary. Just cliffs, cracks, and ledges, carved by wind, rain, and more time than we can really imagine. Then you get closer. Tucked into one of those hillsides is a cluster of shallow rock shelters, more like scooped-out alcoves than true caves. They're small, just big enough to duck into, to get out of the wind for a bit. But on the inside walls, where the rock is soft and carvable, something very strange waits. Figures, symbols, lines etched into sandstone that's been weathered and worn but still hold their shape if you know how to look. At first, it's just scratches. Then your eyes adjust and patterns start to emerge. A curve here, horns there, a long snout, upright ears. Some people look at that particular carving and see an animal spirit, the kind you'd expect in native rock art across the plains. Others look and see something else entirely, a jackal-headed god from half a world away, Anubis, guardian of the dead in ancient Egypt. Anubis, in Oklahoma. That's why this place, for better or worse, is known as the Anubis Caves. For a long time, the carvings were just local oddities. Ranchers and nearby families knew they were there, but no one treated them like a major discovery. That shifted in the late 20th century, when independent researchers began examining them more closely. One of the most passionate voices was Bill McGlone, who became convinced these markings weren't native at all. He and his collaborators documented the carvings, tracing figures that looked to them like rams, scorpions, sun discs, and zodiac symbols more at home in the Mediterranean than on the Great Plains. They started paying attention to light, how, on key days of the year like the equinoxes and solstices, beams of sunlight slid into the shelters at just the right angle to illuminate specific carvings. The way the shadows moved made some figures seem to activate, as if the caves were designed to track the sky. To McGlone, this wasn't coincidence. This was astronomy, ritual, a celestial calendar carved into Oklahoma sandstone. From there, the theory only grew bolder, that ancient seafarers from Egypt or Phoenicia sailed across the Atlantic, moved up rivers into the continent's interior, and left their mark here in the form of stories about gods like Osiris and Anubis coded into stone. In that telling, these 6 little rock shelters in the middle of nowhere become a portal to an old-world mythic cycle, retold thousands of miles from home. Mainstream archaeologists are not convinced. Most experts argue there's no solid evidence tying the carvings to Egyptians, Phoenicians, or any Old World explorers. The sandstone here is too soft to reliably date. No tools, pottery, or bones have been recovered from the caves that could anchor the carvings in time. Without that context, the lines on the wall become a Rorschach test. People see what they expect to see. Skeptics suggest the figures may be Native American in origin, perhaps abstract animal spirits, or symbolic designs that coincidentally resemble Egyptian motifs to modern eyes. Others think the carvings could be much more recent, made in the 1800s or early 1900s by settlers, secret societies, or amateurs fascinated by ancient symbolism. But hard proof either way? It just isn't there. You can't simply stroll up and decide for yourself either. The Anubis Caves sit on private land now, with limited access. No visitor center, no brochures, no gift shop. The site exists in a kind of half-known state, talked about in books, documentaries, and online rabbit holes, but physically out of reach for most people. And maybe that distance makes the mystery feel even sharper. Because the part that everyone seems to agree on, believer or skeptic, is this. Sitting in those tiny alcoves as the light shifts and the carvings slowly reveal themselves feels different. People talk about a strange calm, a sense of standing in a place that mattered deeply to someone long ago, even if we can't say exactly who. Maybe the caves are evidence of ancient explorers. Maybe they're the work of more recent hands, layering new symbols over old land. Either way, the Anubis Caves remind us that history isn't always tidy. Sometimes it's just a set of lines carved into stone, daring us to decide what story they tell. Leave the sandstone bluffs and strange carvings behind and head southwest, back into that version of Oklahoma that looks almost empty at first glance. Near the little town of Cooperton, the land opens up into wide, quiet fields. Dry grass sways in the wind. A few scattered rocks. Fence posts. The same big sky that seems to go on forever. It's the kind of place you'd drive past without even rolling down the window. But under one of those fields, the past was sleeping. In the 1,950 seconds, a local landowner was out doing an ordinary job plowing, metal cutting through soil, back and forth, the same way it had been done for years. Then the blade hit something that wasn't dirt. When he checked, he didn't find a buried pipe or an old horseshoe. He found a stone tool. It was long, thin, and deadly sharp, with a clean channel fluted down the middle on both sides. This wasn't a random broken rock. This was craftsmanship, intent, a spear point made for serious work. To trained eyes, it looked almost exactly like the points made by what archaeologists call the Folsom culture. People who lived more than 10,000 years ago. Near the end of the last ice age, that one discovery changed the meaning of that field forever. The Folsom story really kicked off back in the 1,920 seconds when fossilized bones of an extinct Ice Age bison were found in New Mexico with fluted spear points lying right beside them. That scene, ancient weapon, ancient animal, still together proved that humans were in North America during the Ice Age, hunting massive creatures in a world of ice and giant mammals. Before that, researchers weren't even sure people had been here that long. Folsom points are works of art in stone. They're thin, symmetrical, and fluted. A long, shallow channel chipped away from each face to make them lighter and easier to haft onto spear shafts. They were designed to bring down big game Ice Age bison, maybe even mammoths. You don't casually make something like that. You learn it. You practice it. You pass the skill down. So when a point like that turns up in a quiet Oklahoma field near Cooperton, it raises big questions. The first find wasn't the only one. More tools emerged from the same area. Scrapers, blades, additional projectile points. Some matched that classic Folsom look. Others seemed slightly different, maybe from related cultures that came a little later, but still carried echoes of the same knapping traditions. All of it was buried under several feet of soil, hidden away until a plow finally cut deep enough. Here's the frustrating part. Back then, archaeological protections and practices were nothing like they are now. The land wasn't locked down for systematic excavation. Soil layers weren't mapped in detail. Some artifacts ended up in private collections, some in university drawers, some probably lost entirely. Without that careful context, the exact depth, the position, the surrounding material, it's harder to say exactly what we're looking at. Some experts believe the Cooperton point is a true Folsom artifact. Others call it Folsom-like, suggesting it might come from a later group that inherited or reinvented the fluting technique. Either way, The skill behind it is unmistakable, and that's what sticks with you. Picture the person who made it 10, maybe 12,000 years ago, kneeling on that same land with a chunk of stone in their hand. The climate cooler, herds of massive animals moving across the plains. This wasn't a world of fences and highways. It was a living, shifting hunting ground. Every strike of the hammerstone on that point mattered. Too hard, and it shattered. Too soft, and it failed. But when they got it right, they created a tool that could feed a family or a whole band. Now, that same land is just a quiet field near Cooperton. No sign, no marker, no visitors center. You could stand there and hear nothing but wind in the grass and the faint sound of insects. You wouldn't know that beneath your feet, in the disturbed soil and lost layers, lay evidence that some of the earliest people on this continent walked here, hunted here, lived and died here. The Cooperton site is a reminder that history doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it's a single stone point turned up by a plow. Sometimes it's a story that almost disappears because no one realized how important it was at the time. And it makes you wonder, how many more Ice Age stories are still buried under fields like this, quiet, unmarked, just waiting for someone to notice? Head back north, toward the dry hills of northwestern Oklahoma, where the land feels sun-bleached and old. Out here, people come for one main attraction: Alabaster Caverns. Tour buses roll up, families buy tickets, and guides lead them down into the cool, echoing dark. The cavern walls are made of rare gypsum, white and ghostly, catching the light in soft reflections. Some of it glows pink or black depending on the minerals. Bats whisper from above. Footsteps echo in that way that makes everyone instinctively lower their voice. It feels ancient, and it is. But the real whisper of deep time isn't under the ground everybody sees. It's outside, scattered quietly across the hills nearby. A few miles from the main cave, hidden among rocky bluffs and shallow overhangs, are rock shelters most visitors never hear about. No big signs point the way. No ranger with a flashlight leads a tour. On the walls of these natural alcoves, faded by sun and rain and dust, are marks. Simple ones. Lines, spirals, stick figures, shapes you could almost miss if you weren't looking for them. These aren't grand murals like in famous European caves. There are no full-color herds of painted animals. Just small human traces that somehow feel personal. A spiral scratched into stone. A figure with raised arms. A faint suggestion of bison or deer. In a few places, if the light hits right, you can still spot traces of red ochre clinging stubbornly to the rock, refusing to let go after who knows how many centuries. Who made them? Archaeologists lean toward early native peoples, maybe ancestors from the Plains Archaic period, maybe even older hunter-gatherers moving with the seasons along the Cimarron River. These shelters would have offered shade, protection from storms, and quiet spaces where people could gather, tell stories, pray, or wait out the heat. Some think the markings relate to hunting rituals, asking for success or giving thanks. Others see them as records of visions from fasting and solitary vigils. Still others think they could mark the turning of seasons, sunlight aligning with certain shapes on certain days like a prehistoric calendar. The truth is, we don't know for sure, and the story gets even messier. Because these shelters haven't always been respected or carefully studied, there's a tangled mix of old and new on the walls. Ancient spirals might sit beside carved initials from the 1950 seconds. A genuine centuries-old figure can share space with a clumsy modern attempt to add to the scene. Some areas have been scarred with spray paint and casual vandalism. In places, whatever message was left thousands of years ago has been partly overwritten by people who never knew or never cared what they were erasing. It's a quiet kind of damage. No explosion, no dramatic headline, just one small mark over another, until the original voice fades. And yet, what survives still hits hard. You see a handprint, or a simple figure with arms raised, and suddenly it's not ancient people in the abstract, it's one person, standing exactly where you're standing now, reaching out with pigment or stone to leave something behind. Not for fame, not for a camera, just so there would be a mark. So someone, someday, might know they were there. We like to imagine the distant past as alien, but the people who walked these hills weren't so different from us. They watched the sky. They worried about food, about children, about enemies. They had dreams big enough to carve into rock, and sometimes, those dreams are still there, if we bother to look closely. Taken together, all of Oklahoma's mysteries, the Heavener Runestone, the buried city of Spiro, the strange carvings of the Anubis Caves, the Ice Age tools at Cooperton, the fading art near Alabaster Caverns tell us the same thing. This land has been lived in, believed in, argued over, and marked for a very long time. Some stories have been looted, some twisted, some almost lost. But they're not gone. Not completely. We don't have to solve every riddle to honor them. We don't have to agree on Vikings or Egyptians or exact dates. What matters is that we pay attention, that we treat these places not as empty scenery, but as pages in a book we're still learning how to read. Because every stone carving, every fluted point, every fading spiral on a cave wall is proof of one simple, powerful thing. The land remembers, even when we forget.